Hi, everyone. It's Canadian Infertility Awareness Week, and all week long, we're bringing you great content about what it's like to endure a fertility journey and meeting with lots of professionals in the fertility community to help educate you and bring you resources to help you along your journey. So today, I'm very happy to be here with Dara Roth Edney, a reproductive counselor and founder of Informed Fertility. Hi, Dara.
Hi, thank you so much for having me here. It's amazing that Canadian Infertility Awareness Week, which corresponds with, I know the, excuse me, Infertility Awareness Week with that other countries are holding. And it's amazing to have this attention to such an important issue. And I'm really thrilled to be part of it. So thank you for the invitation.
Thank you so much for coming. Today, we're going to be talking about the mental health impact of infertility. With Bell Let's Talk and various other focuses on mental health over the course of the pandemic, we felt like this was a really important topic because people going through fertility treatments and people trying to expand their family and it's not happening that easily are compounded with everything that we just endured for the last 2 years, plus the added stress and impact of having to go through fertility treatments and things like that, when that journey on its own is very impactful to your mental health. So the theme of Canadian Infertility Awareness Week this year is Find Your Joy. And we want to help bring you more education on mental health, mental wellness, and overall physical wellness as well. So you'll see a lot of topics on that over the course of this week. So today, mental health impact of infertility. Dara, can you just talk more generally about how infertility can affect one's mental health?
Absolutely. So, there's a study, I know there's been a number of studies that have shown what I'm about to say, but the one that I like to highlight is actually out of Harvard, and that's why I like to highlight it. And it was from a number of years ago. And there was a paper that showed that people who have ongoing infertility, who are living with ongoing infertility, have similar rates of depression and anxiety as people diagnosed with heart disease, with HIV, with cancer. So infertility is a really, really big deal, as is reproductive loss. And sometimes those overlap, and lots of people have trouble getting pregnant. And when they get pregnant, they have a loss. But some people are in one category or the other. And so the word infertility for somebody who is continuously getting pregnant, they may not feel like that fits them. But that idea of how it impacts you would be the same regardless of which category, let's say medically, you might find yourself in. So it's a very big deal, and that's something that everybody who's going through it knows. And it's something that certainly I tell clients when they come to me and they feel like they're not coping well because they're crying a lot, or they don't want to see family or friends, or they're depressed, they're anxious, and they feel like they're not coping, or they feel like they're responding in a way that doesn't necessarily feel like how they should be because there are worse things. Obviously there are great coping strategies, and we can talk about that today. And I always encourage people to get help and to find different ways of supporting themselves through this experience. But the truth is, there's no way of going through this without it being unbelievably distressing, and for a lot of people, quite traumatic. So those are actually reasonable ways of responding to what is a devastating and traumatic experience that impacts every aspect of your life. So you asked about some of the impacts. So depression, for some people, that's situational, where somebody who's never had depression before and will never go on to have depression again in their life is responding to a devastating situation with depression. And that's different than grief. We all have grief at different points in our life. It could be about a breakup of a relationship. It could be about, the first time somebody lives away from home and is missing their friends and their community if they've been in the same place their whole life. It could be when somebody you love dies. So there's grief, but depression is beyond grief. Grief is part of depression, but depression is different because it doesn't pass in the same way that grief does. Time doesn't necessarily make a difference with it. And it isn't necessarily focused in one kind of specific area. It can broaden from there. So depression is a big one for people. Anxiety. Anybody who goes through fertility issues or loss knows that part of the deep distress that you feel is about not knowing what things are happening, the lack of control, getting bad news, thinking you're getting good news, having it be bad news, not understanding the news, constantly in a state of waiting and then rushing for things to happen. So increased anxiety is very common, and lots of people I speak to are then diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorders. And post-traumatic stress disorder, which I sort of don't know if the post is really an accurate way of describing it, because when people are still in the midst of fertility treatment, it actually isn't post at all. But lots of people I speak to have similar symptoms to post-traumatic stress disorder from all of the things that happen within a clinic setting and even at home in terms of trying again and again, and all of the things that happen if you're a straight couple and having that despair month after month. And obviously it impacts every aspect of one's life, from your job to your intimate relationship if you have a partner, to your friendships and family, your sense of self, your sense of identity. So there isn't actually your finances, there isn't one aspect of your life that it isn't touching on. And I think that's one of the things that people outside of this don't really get.
Wow, you're like taking me back to a place, Dara. I'm years removed from our fertility journey, but everything you said still like resonates so much with what my experience was. Um, you mentioned how it impacts every aspect of your life, and it's so true. There's so many decisions you have to make in the normal course of your life, like what car to buy, what your house is going to look like. Um, you know, things that seem easy to most people, but you're making a decision based on having no idea what your family is going to look like and not knowing if you should account for the family you want or the family that you have in that moment. So all of those things can be very traumatic
Absolutely.
experiences.
Absolutely. And I would say, and I know this is also what you mean, that it isn't only about you don't know what your family's going to look like, but you don't know what you're going to be doing. Are you going to be in the middle of a
Mhm.
cycle? Are you going to be in the middle of a miscarriage? Are you going to be preparing for a cycle? Are you going to be, so there's this feeling of sort of being trapped in amber, like that you can't move forward because you don't know what forward looks like. I once had somebody say, that it feels like sort of being in purgatory. And I actually disagree. I actually think it's hell. I think that there are very few things that are worse than uncertainty in a significant way in your life. There's knowing something is bad, as bad as that is, what it is, it's definitive,
Mhm.
and you can get the supports that you need through too, and you could take the time you need to figure that out and move through it. But an uncertainty of not knowing when things are going to happen or what they're going to look like when they do happen, that I think there are very few things in life that are as unsettling as that. And that absolutely goes to some of the trauma. And you said how it brings you back. I went through many, many, many years of infertility, and people who know me know this. Like, it's on my, I talk about it in terms of my own experiences. It obviously informs my practice. And so I went through, I think it was almost 6 years of trying before I had my daughter, and I did 6 cycles of IVF, and eventually I had my 2 children. I had them through gestational surrogacy, and many, many, many years after both my kids were born and my family was finished, I was at a doctor's office, and I had endometriosis, and we were talking about treatment options, and she mentioned Lupron, and I had such a panic attack that my partner in the waiting room heard me crying and like came
Oh
running
my
to me.
gosh.
And that must have been maybe 10 years after. So lots of pieces of this fade to the background. Lots of parts of it don't live with you every day and every moment. The depression doesn't, the anxiety doesn't, like a lot of that stuff fades to the background. But I do think that without really working through some of those things, and I obviously had not done that, right? The cobbler's children, like not wearing, what do they say about the doctor who doesn't treat.
Right.
So, obviously I hadn't. And just like the idea of going back on Lupron, even though it was like unrelated to
Mhm.
fertility in that moment. So I think that a lot of people don't recognize the signs of PTSD in themselves. I think it's not something that is talked about a lot. This is more than just something that's hard. I mean, this is really traumatic, and it's traumatic in so many different ways. And it goes on for some people for a really long time.
I completely hear you. Before we started recording, I shared a story with you about having to get an ultrasound, and just laying there in the dark waiting for an ultrasound brought back so many memories for me that, and I thought I was all better. I thought I was all healed and years removed from any kind of fertility treatment. And still, it was like, oh my God, just the feelings that flood you
Of course,
without any expectation.
of
So
course.
I completely understand. I feel like a lot of people watching right now feel very seen to have you put names to all of the things that they may have been feeling or might be feeling right now.
I do want to say though, just for you and for anybody who's hearing this, I don't want somebody to feel like years later you're still going to be feeling the same.
Oh,
And that feeling that you said, where you said, I thought I was better. And it's funny, not funny,
yeah.
but I can remember being in that doctor's office where she was started talking about Lupron, and I had like really, like, I was beyond, like, again, like my partner heard me crying from the waiting room, and I also had that same feeling, like, oh my God, I thought I was better, like I thought this was behind me. But I really encourage people to think about this the same way you would think about a death. Like if there was somebody that you love who died, um my dad died. 10 years after he died, if something happened that made me cry, I wouldn't beat myself up because I wasn't over it yet. Like there are
Right.
just some things that you work through. There are some things that don't come up for you anymore or often, but there are some things that are so huge that they actually just never go away completely. And so I think about it as when you're in the middle of it, it feels like this huge gaping open wound that it's sort of astonishing that walking down the street, people think that you're just like a normal person. They don't understand or know that you are going through this thing that is so monumental and so painful. They can't see that looking at you, which seems amazing because it's so huge and it feels like this huge gaping wound. And later it's like a little scar where most of the time you don't even notice you have it, but once in a while you look down and you're like, oh yeah, or it itches a little bit or something happens that makes it kind of get a little red that day and you're like, oh yeah, that's still part of who I am. But
Mhm.
it's closed up and it doesn't come up all the time or often even.
I heard this great TED talk that randomly, but this great TED talk that it was like, you don't move on from grief, you move forward with it. So,
Absolutely.
grief and pain and all of those things change you. Like they change you, some most of the time for the better, I would imagine. You come out the other end and you're like, I'm a strong human being, and you might not have known that about yourself before, but it informs who you become. So I
Absolutely. There's a beautiful, for anybody who's interested, you can find it on YouTube. It's an interview with Anderson Cooper and Stephen Colbert. It's probably one of the more beautiful things I've ever seen about grief. And Stephen Colbert, when he was 10, his father, and he was one of like 11 or 12 kids, and his father and the two brothers closest in age to him, he was the youngest, his two closest age brothers died in a plane crash. And Anderson Cooper, who had, was had quite a privileged life. His mom was Gloria Vanderbilt. She had recently died, long, good, full life, like 90 or something. I think he also had a dad who died young. Anyway, the two of them, it's a conversation about grief. And for anybody who's watching, if you look for it, you'll see little clips that are like a minute or 3 minutes. Look for the whole thing, which I think is like 20 or 23 minutes. And they talk about grief. And Anderson Cooper talks about wishing that he had a huge scar on his face. So when he went out in the world, everybody would know he wasn't okay, because looking at him, it looks like he is. That really resonated with me.
Yeah.
And Stephen Colbert talks about how he learned to move on from that devastating tragedy and how he learned through his life to be grateful for the thing he wished never happened. That he wished that, of course, he wished that his brothers were alive. He wished that his
Mhm.
father was alive. But how could he move forward knowing that they weren't? And there was nothing he could do about that. Like, what would that mean? And how could he find meaning in that? And those are all things that one does on the other side of grief, not when you're in the middle of it. But for anybody who's interested, it was a very powerful discussion between the two of them about what grief means. And also the idea of gratitude, which I know the theme for this month, for this year's Canadian Fertility, it's finding joy. Is that, am I
Find your joy. Yeah.
find your joy, right? And for a lot of people, understanding what gratitude means and how that could work in your own life can help with that. And so that is certainly part of what Stephen Colbert talks about, again, on the other side of his grief, not when
Right.
he's in the middle of it. Mhm.
Right. Well, that was a little bit of a variant of what we're supposed to talk about, but I loved it. Um, let's narrow in. You started talking about depression and situational depression. Um, can you talk about what situational depression is and how to maybe identify that you might be at someone that
Sure,
might be experiencing that?
sure, absolutely. So, situational depression, or I would even put it in terms of situational, like a mood disorder. So,
Mhm.
depression or anxiety would be 2 weeks or more of feeling fairly unremitting emotions. So, that could be, for example, if it's mood, if it's lower mood like depression, that would be 2 or more weeks of really significantly low mood. So that might be not wanting to do the things that you usually want to do, having feelings, personal feelings about low self worth, or for sure any thoughts of suicide or harming oneself. But it doesn't always have to be that. It doesn't have to be necessarily that extreme. It's, sometimes we're going through a hard time, but we still are really looking forward to seeing a friend, or we're still looking forward to going out for dinner or to watching a movie, or we still are getting like a lot of joy out of something that we usually do. So people start to feel like maybe there's something else going on, where it's 2 weeks or more and they're crying a lot, or they're really exhausted, like not able to get out of bed and no interest in getting out of bed. For some people it's impacting their sleep and their eating, so they're not eating, or they're significantly overeating. I remember when I was going through infertility, and a clinician gave me a depression scale to see if I was depressed, and the questions were all like, have you lost your appetite? And I was like, no. Do I look like I've lost my appetite? It's the exact opposite. I'm like going through it all the
I
time.
eat
No,
everything
that's not.
now. Yeah.
Yeah, like that's not what happens to me when I'm under a
Mhm.
lot of stress, or when I'm feeling really depressed. I do not lose my appetite. So it could go either way. Where and the anxiety piece could be the same kind of thing, where it's it's not that things are happening that you shouldn't feel anxious about, although sometimes it can be that. It's that your level of anxiety is significantly more than it usually would have been, or other people around you. So there could be a whole bunch of things in a week that normally would make you feel a little bit anxious, but now it's actually making you feel completely panicky. Or you're over planning for every single thing because you're trying to control everything around you, to the point where you're not sleeping because you're sort of over planning and coming up with plan, DEFG. So
Mhm.
really the idea is that it's 2 weeks or more of, whether it's low mood or increased anxiety, that's impacting your function in some kind of way. And really there are, if anybody out there is watching and you're wondering if that's what's happening with you, there are just kind of online quizzes, not like the Cosmo ones, but you could find like sort of like the fairly easy scale. Usually they're like kind of 10 question ones where you can just do them, and if any of those any of the things on those resonate with you, then I absolutely suggest that you go and you speak to your family doctor, or if you have a psychiatrist, speak to your psychiatrist. And there are people, for example, who have depression or generalized anxiety beforehand, that's really well managed, right? Lots of people who were
Mhm.
diagnosed with a generalized anxiety disorder, or a depressive disorder, and they are taking a medication that's been working well for them for years, and they have their lifestyle habits, and all of it's going actually fairly well. And then this happened, and it throws kind of everything off balance, and they really feel like I was doing so well.
Mhm.
And so again, you can have a situational depression within that kind of thing that's already there, and it just might mean that you need some extra support. So if you're already taking medication, it might mean a tweak of your medication. If you're not taking medication, depending on what it's doing and how much it's impairing your function, that might be something you talk about with your doctor. And of course, there's all kinds of complementary things that can be done that are sort of what's like complementary health services, like acupuncture and naturopathy, counseling. So there's all kinds of things that are other than medication, that are lifestyle support things that can really be incredibly beneficial in terms of managing any kind of mood disorder that would come out of what is an unbelievably difficult time.
Thank you. Thanks for that. So, what are some of the tips that you have? I know tips seems like such a small word given the context of our discussion right now, but what are some tips that you have for people who are living with these conditions or disorders, but they're still having to go through the motions of pursuing fertility treatment simultaneously?
Yeah, absolutely. And through the what feels like the motions of life, like going to
Hmm.
work, or if you've taken a leave from your job, still do, getting groceries or doing laundry, or, all of the things that we have to do as being part of being here and moving forward in our lives. And I want to say that this, what I'm about to say, is useful, not just people who are experiencing a clinical depression or anxiety, because there's a point where you could be feeling depressed or feeling anxious, but it's not clinical. Like it doesn't quite
Right.
meet the criteria for something where a diagnostician would be like, this is depression, this is anxiety, but you know that you're not feeling yourself, you're not feeling okay. And so any of these tips would work in any of these scenarios. The first thing I would say, interestingly enough, is recognize how awful this is. A lot of people, which sounds sort of backwards, I don't know if anybody watching has heard of the phrase toxic positivity or has seen Brene Brown. She's done a ton of stuff on toxic positivity. There's some really good stuff out there. And toxic positivity is that, like, you can always have it worse, and look on the bright side and be grateful for what you have. And, for people who are going through secondary infertility, at least you have one child, or, I'm sure this IVF is going to work, or, I'm sure this next pregnancy is going to be good. The next time you get pregnant, it's going to be great. It's all going to be fine. Or it's just this
Mhm.
like positivity that is completely devoid of any sense of reality, or any sense of the fact that that's not always how life goes. And so I know a lot of people I speak to feel like if they think anything negative, it's like going to jinx it. And that people tell them, like, you just have to think positive. So then, on top of the distress that they're already feeling, they're feeling guilty because they are not getting pregnant, or they're having miscarriages, and then they're feeling guilty because they're upset about it. Or they're
Yep.
feeling guilty because they're feeling completely
Right.
normal emotions of despair and worry and anxiety. Um, and we live in a world where a lot of bad things are going on. So I have people say to me, like, how could I be complaining that I'm not getting pregnant when like I'm not in Ukraine? Like, I'm not, like, there are so many things happening around us that are kind of so much worse.
Mhm.
And so when people say to me, like, it just, I know it could be much worse, I always say, like, well, it could also be a lot better. So I think that the first part of it is being really gentle with yourself, giving yourself some grace, really recognizing that your feelings of despair and hopelessness, they're coming from a place of reason. Like, it makes sense why you're feeling that way, because you're going through something that is devastating, and you have a right to feel the way you feel. And having perspective and knowing that there are things that are worse is useful, because perspective is useful. But the truth is that doesn't actually help in the moment, because what you're going through is the worst thing that you've ever gone through. Right. And it's true that if you go through something worse, then this won't be as bad. But right
Mhm.
now, if this is the worst thing you've been through, it is legitimately the worst thing you've been through. And you have a right to have that validated. You have a right to have that acknowledged. So I think the first part is to recognize that you're not being silly or selfish for feeling completely normal human emotions. And none of us have the power for our emotion to make us get pregnant or not, or to have a miscarriage or not. And a good reminder of that is that there are plenty of heterosexual, fertile young couples who start off trying without any sense that something is wrong, and they don't get pregnant, or they have miscarriages. And women get pregnant through rape. Women get pregnant in refugee camps. So there are women get pregnant when they aren't homed properly in abusive relationships, right? So it is true that having a positive attitude can be beneficial, in the sense that it feels terrible to feel so awful. So the reason why it's useful to look at, like, what are the tips and tricks and things to, like, help us get through these times is incredibly important, because without it, your resiliency drops to the bottom, and you don't have the strength that you need to actually get through the treatment that you want to get through. So there's tremendous benefit to that. I just want to make sure people know that how you feel is not going to be responsible for whether or not your IVF cycle works, or whether your insemination works, or whether your pregnancy continues, or whether that embryo is miscarried. That has nothing to do with it.
That is such amazing advice. I remember being in the middle of it and thinking, did I manifest this? And I don't even believe in that. Like, do you know what I mean? But you're grasping at reasons and trying to make sense of what's happening. And sometimes you can't make sense of what's happening, and that's what's the hardest part of this.
Absolutely. And sometimes it does feel a little bit like, if it is my fault, as terrible as that is, it's actually a good thing, because then I can do it differently next time.
Mhm.
Like if I can
Yeah.
control why it happened, because it's my fault, then I can do it differently next time. So I think, one of the suggestions that I have for people is to try not to think in such binary terms. So where this idea that somehow you have to think positive. And the problem with that, first of all, I think it's an impossible thing to ask of yourself when you're going through this. But also it doesn't even make sense logically, because nobody will be able to tell you that something is 100% going to work. Like that's just actually not true. Even in the best of circumstances, IVF is still like a 60% pregnancy rate. Like nobody can tell you that something is going to work 100%. So the reason why being positive, the reason why it doesn't actually work in just like a sort of a modality, is because you don't believe it. Like when you say to yourself, this time it's going to work, this time it's going to work, part of you doesn't believe it because part of you knows that it might not. And that's fair enough. Like it's true, it actually might not. But the opposite is also true. When you tell yourself, I know it's not going to work, I'm not going to get my hopes up, I know I'm going to have another miscarriage, or the last IVF didn't work, I know this isn't going to, or we've done 4 inseminations, there's no reason that I know it's not going to work. That's actually also not true, because you don't know it's not going to work. And if you truly believed it wasn't going to work, why would you do it? So part of you does believe it's going to work. So I actually believe that people hold both those things as truths. You believe, like a big part of you really does believe it's not going to work, because you know rationally and realistically and truthfully, you know it might not. And a big part of you, or a little part of you, depending on your personality, thinks it will work. Or why would you spend $20,000 on IVF? Why would you spend $1,000 buying donor sperm? Why would you do any of the things any of us do when we're trying so desperately to have children? So my suggestion to people is to try and find a place in between the negative and the positive, in between sort of hopefulness, where it's just sort of that blind optimism, and total despair. So for example, it is 100% true that your IVF might work. So looking for what are statements that are 100% authentic, that you absolutely believe, that are leaning towards the positive. For example, there is a much better chance that this is going to work than it's not. There's no medical reason this is not going to work. Right? So what are the facts that give you reason to be hopeful? And then finding a statement that feels like the right statement for you, that is real and true, and leaning towards the optimistic. And the nice thing about that is that my brain was very, very skilled at talking myself into a very deep hole of despair. I was the best at it. And when you say a statement that you don't believe, you can always talk yourself out of it. Like, be hopeful, it's going to work this time. And then you can, you have like you go into a spiral about why it won't. But if you say to yourself, it's 100% possible that this might work, and your brain says, but what if it doesn't? And you say to your brain, but what if it does? Like it really might. The doctor is really hopeful. It really could work. And if your brain is like, but it didn't last time, and you just say, but what if it does this time? Mm-hmm. So you kind of can't argue with possibility, because it's true.
Yeah. Where were you? I feel really annoyed that it went through my entire fertility journey not having met you, and then met you right afterwards. That's very frustrating for me.
Well, I'm laughing with the compliment, but I'm so sorry that you didn't get the support that you deserved when you were going through this. I truly believe it is one of the hardest things that people can go through, and it is one of one of the least understood. I had a client who told me that she went off on somebody she knew because somebody she knew who was trying to be supportive said to her, "Oh, this is the week you do IVF, right?" And she was like, "No, I'm doing IVF all of the time." Like she just said it just like she just like completely kind of flipped out because it just showed how much people think like the same thing
Yeah.
with miscarriage. People think like one day you're pregnant, one day you're not. And as
Mhm.
terrible as a miscarriage is, they just think like you're pregnant, then you're not. And they don't know that actually miscarriage can go on for months and months.
Yeah.
That IVF, it could actually be months of getting ready for an IVF, of having it delayed, of trying again, of getting like people they don't understand that, which is why they don't understand why it does impact every day, all of these things. And so
Mhm.
finding that place of possibility helps us access some hope, which we have anyway, which is part of what we need to build that resilience. So, if you're constantly in a state of despair with no reprieve from that, you're just beat down, beat down, beat down. There's no ability to kind of catch your breath and be like, okay, I got this.
So, living in regret for having not sought out the support that I needed in the time, when would you recommend that someone seek out a reproductive counselor in this
Yeah.
journey?
So I think people should start right away. I mean, I think one of the things that, people are sent to me when they are doing egg donation, when they're doing sperm donation, when they're doing surrogacy. People are sent to me if they are crying every time they talk to their doctor and their doctor is like, I think you should see a therapist. But actually the truth is that straight couples are already traumatized by the time they get to a clinic. Right? Straight couples have spent anywhere,
Mhm.
depending on how old they are, from 6 months to I see people who have been trying on their own for 3, 4 years and more before they get to a clinic. By the time I got to a clinic, I was completely traumatized already from months and months and months of trying and the despair of getting my period every month while all of my friends were getting babies.
Mhm.
So, I ideally, in my ideal world, people are seeing a therapist who specializes in fertility and in loss right when they come to the clinic and they get their blood work and they do a sono, and if they're
Yep.
obviously if they have a uterus, they do those things, and then they're seeing a counselor, and if they're a single person or a queer couple who have no known infertility and they're feeling pretty good, great. So it's just a check in to find out, are there any fears that you have? What is your plan? How can I be supportive? The idea that the first time you connect with a therapist is when you're in deep despair and trauma and crisis. It's not a great time to find somebody who has a 3 month wait list. And
Yeah.
it's not a great time to figure out if you're a good fit for somebody. Like this gives you an opportunity to see, oh, do I like this person? Do I feel like we're a good fit? Maybe I never see them again. But then if things start to become a struggle, you already have somebody that you feel comfortable with, and you can really then feel comfortable going with them to them for these sort of big things.
That's amazing advice. I think I think that wraps us up. Do you have any parting words, Dara?
I would say, do we have 2 more minutes for me to give one
Of
more tip?
course.
Okay.
Of course
And this
you
goes
do.
this goes to the theme, finding joy. One of the things that I remember feeling very frustrated by was this idea that, when things are so hard and when you're feeling so awful that, just try and do the things that made you happy before. Like, just try and do things that make you happy. And I just was like, nothing makes me happy. Like, unless you have a baby for me, there's nothing like, what could I possibly do that's going to make me feel happy? Along with the fact that a lot of things that made me happy I couldn't do, right? Like, going
Mhm.
out with friends and having a glass of wine, going on vacation. So prior to COVID, of course, there was Zika. So I know people would say, oh, you just go on vacation and relax. You're like, I can't go anywhere, like
Yeah.
because of Zika. And now because
Nowhere I want to go.
there's nowhere
Yeah.
left, right? And none of those things were equal to having a baby. So those things to me at the time felt like ridiculous. Like it felt insulting to me that somehow like going for a walk in the woods or going on a vacation or like reading a good book, somehow that was going to like make me happy. And many years later, I realized that that was looking at it the wrong way. And I think this is why I'm so thrilled with what the theme is this year, that it isn't about being happy. Being happy is, to me, this thing that we're somehow supposed to work to achieve. And when we achieve it, we're supposed to stay there like a place. And then if you are not there anymore, you've somehow failed at happy. So I see it more as like, where are moments of joy? where are moments of reprieve? Where are moments where despair isn't all of what you're feeling? So if in a given day you do a yoga class for 40 minutes where you feel calm and connected with your breath, you go for a run where you feel strong and energized, you watch a funny movie, you have a good conversation with a friend, you read a book, you sort of like any of those things that actually just make you feel not despair. At the end of the day, maybe what you have is an hour and a half where you were laughing and you had some fun. Maybe you had 2 hours where you felt connected and understood by somebody. Maybe you had 40 minutes where you felt strong and secure in something your body can do. Maybe you had a great cuddle or hug with somebody you love and you felt comforted. So does that make you happy? No. Does that make you feel full with joy? No. But actually what it does maybe is out of a 12-hour or 14-hour day that you're awake, maybe you've cobbled together 6 hours that have actually been okay, or maybe even good. And so to me, that's the goal, that you're looking for, like, where are things that can sort of like spark those moments. And so, an hour and a half funny movie isn't going to make infertility or miscarriage better, but it might make that hour and a half better. And so to me, that's the goal.
I love that advice. I found in my own journey, I was afraid to do the things that I loved because of, if I watched a movie, was there going to be a surprise pregnancy that I didn't foresee? Or if I went out with a friend, were they going to tell me that they're pregnant? Like there's so much fear about doing all of the things that I loved doing, but when I did them, I never regretted them. They passed the time until the next day, and then I got to choose those things again. It's just sometimes you get so in your head about the potential negative things that could happen that you forget that when you actually do them, they are positive things, or at least not negative things.
You know what? I mean, I think that's true. I think that's very true often. I also think sometimes they are negative things, but then you can figure out what can you do differently. So for example,
Right.
if you like going for walks in the woods, I'm saying that because I do, if I on a Saturday find a trail and go at 9 a.m, it's going to be full of families with little kids, but it won't be if I go at 4 p.m. Right. So if I'm in a group, if I'm with a group of friends, all of whom have kids, they are absolutely all going to be talking about their babies and their pregnancies. But if I go with one of them, then there'll be space for us to talk about different things. So sometimes it's actually being strategic in the things that you did before that you enjoyed, the things that you would like to do but are afraid of, and thinking, how can I do this a bit strategically? And certainly in terms of movies and shows, like, I'm sure if you go online, because we talk about it in my support groups all the time, like, what are the safe ones? So far, the big one is Walking Dead, because the only pregnant person. But certainly, like, the idea of, I'm sure if you Googled, like, what are TV shows and movies that are safe to watch, I'm sure that there's a whole list of them for people. And that's a reasonable thing not to, it's terrible when you have a show that you love and all of a sudden you're sort of hit in the face with a pregnancy and it just like wrecks all of it for you. So, being able to say, okay, I would like to find those things. And then, okay, how do you find them? So being strategic about those things that you think might bring you some reprieve. And to me, that's a better way of thinking about it, as opposed to like finding happiness, is like, how can you find some reprieve from your despair, from your grief, from your sorrow, from your anxiety? And in that reprieve, how can you find moments of joy, of strength, of comfort?
That's great. Great advice. As usual, that is great advice, Dara. Well, I want to really sincerely thank you for spending this time with us. I think that this chat will be hopefully very helpful to people who maybe haven't felt seen in the course of their journey, and are maybe this is their first time having that conversation about, mental wellness in this journey, because you're right, everyone feels like, this shouldn't be as big of a thing as it is, but it is. So hopefully you found this. Hopefully you took some amazing tips away. And as you can tell, I love chatting with Dara. Dara will have you back again for sure.
Anytime.
So thank you so much to everyone watching. Please tune in throughout the rest of this week and check out the other great resources that are coming to you for Canadian Infertility Awareness Week. And good luck in your journey.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye, Dara.
Bye.